Good afternoon and welcome to the University of Tasmania online series for Alumni Explore. And this is our first session back in 2022. Firstly, as a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of the island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people, and custodians of the land on which we meet, and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Rob Blanford, and I am the Associate Director of Alumni Relations here at the University of Tasmania. This is also my first time hosting one of the Explore sessions. Our series, Explore, provides an opportunity specifically for you, alumni of the university, for advancement and inspiration. One of the greatest advantages of being a member of the alumni community is the ability to tap into a group of influential individuals. Apologies. Being able to tap into a group of influential individuals who have vast global impact. This series offers an exclusive opportunity to connect with your peers, find among them innovators, thought leaders, and perhaps even potential collaborators. You are such an important part of the fabric of the university, and that is why we are providing opportunities to access webinars tailored to your needs, such as this one this afternoon. Just a few housekeeping notes before today's in-conversation gets underway. Your microphone, camera, chat function, and raised hand function have all been disabled, so our guests are not interrupted. But we do encourage you to ask questions of our presenter today, and this can be done by typing them into the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Finally, this session today is being recorded for later access on our YouTube channel. It is clear from the astounding number of registrations that we received for today's event that this topic has resonated with people, as we're increasingly feeling overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and unable to keep up with life's incessant demands. Today, we are lucky enough to be joined by an alumna, medical doctor, and founder of the Burnout Project, author of Burnout, Your First 10 Steps, and a mother of 5. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker, Dr. Amy Imms. Amy graduated with an MB BSc Hons 2007 and spent her early career at the Royal Hobart Hospital and working as a trainee GP in the Greater Hobart area. Since her own experience of burnout in 2016, she has been raising awareness of burnout and assisting individuals and organizations to prevent and manage burnout well, so that employees can have fulfilling and sustainable careers. Amy assists individuals through burnout counseling, online programs, and facilitation of small, supportive online group programs. She works with a large range of organizations to address their needs, anywhere from one-off workshops through to comprehensive assistance, both for staff and management in creating well-being strategies and mitigating risk factors. We're really grateful to have her here today. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you, Rob, and everyone involved in today. It's really exciting to be here and be talking about this. And I love that you've organised a webinar on this and that it is becoming something that we as a society are talking about more. And so to begin with, I just want to talk about what burnout is. It's sort of a word that gets used a lot, and often we mean different things by that word. So what does it really mean? There's been quite a lot of definitions over the years, and it's not really been very well agreed upon. The World Health Organization came out with this definition a few years ago. I don't necessarily agree with every element of it, but it's a pretty good general starting point. So basically, they define burnout as being a result of chronic stress in the workplace that hasn't been successfully managed, and it results in certain symptoms that I'll talk about in a minute. They talk about it really in relation to the workplace specifically. I kind of disagree with that a little bit in that while it sort of fits with that way that they want to frame it, really we see it all over the place. There's any kind of area where you have the demands put upon you greater than the resources that you have to meet those demands, burnout can happen. So that could be in the workplace, but it could also be that you're studying or you're a volunteer or you're a parent of a child with special needs. It's really any kind of role in life, major kind of life role where that can happen. So the three main areas that we're looking at when we look at burnout is the first one is exhaustion. And this is often the one that people experience first. And so it's pretty self-explanatory. You feel really tired all the time, depleted, don't have much energy. Often people aren't sleeping very well either, starting to get that kind of dreading going to work feeling. So, you might pick up a little bit on the weekend and then you get to Sunday night and you just feel deflated and tired and don't want to face Monday morning. The second thing that starts to arise is detachment. So this is where people care less about things. They become cynical. They might become more easily irritated by other people, withdrawn. They might feel guilty about things, but there's real emotional detachment from life and the things that they would normally care for. Often people talk about not being able to care for their family members or their patients or whoever it is in their life who they normally show that compassion for. They just don't feel like they've got that reserve left to do that anymore. And then the third one is reduced efficacy. So this is really talking about the way that we perceive ourselves and the usefulness of the work that we do and what we're achieving through what we do. So people might start to feel as though what I do at work doesn't matter. I'm not really making any difference. And they also can have a feeling that there's no chance of improvement. Their whole sort of situation and everything that's left to their burnout is complex and it's really hard, and you can't see really within the realms of what feels possible how you can ever get out of that. And that's even worse if you've tried before. So you get people who've perhaps tried multiple times to improve their situation and it hasn't worked, so they become more defeated and more like there's no hope to get out of this situation. That reduced efficacy side of things is often a perceived reduced efficacy. So somebody might actually be still performing very well, but they just feel like they're not doing a very good job. Other times, burnout's got to the point where they're actually not performing as well. So often as a result of these exhaustion and detachment, people are not functioning as well. They don't concentrate as well. They don't make decisions as well, all those sorts of things. And so they actually start to perform not so well as their job as they usually would. So they're those three key signs that we're looking for with burnout. Depending on the level of burnout and individual response, you may not show all three of those. You might show them one by one, not all at once. So this is just a bit of a diagram that shows that kind of process and how that would develop over time. And so we're looking here at stage one is kind of when people are thriving, they're engaged, they're productive, they're enjoying their work, they're feeling fulfilled through that. And then over time, in kind of circumstances which can bring on burnout, then they start feeling more stressed. That turns into chronic stress and feeling frustrated. And then this is where we're seeing that element of detachment or depersonalization coming in stage 4. So there's that kind of apathy. They're not really caring so much about things. And then habitual burnout. So it says under stage 5, intervention. So normally when we're seeing people who are burnt out, when they start to seek some sort of help for it, then at stage 5. And the earlier that we intervene, then the easier and quicker it is to recover and get back to somewhere towards stage 1. So ideally, what we're trying to do is get people to recognize things at stage 2 or 3 and start putting some measures in there, or even better, at stage 1, if people recognize that they themselves personally are at higher risk of burnout than others, or that they are working in a job or a workplace which puts them at higher risk, or they might not see any of those risk factors, but just realize that statistically burnout is very common, and putting in preventative strategies before that, just seeing that all of us are likely at some point in life to burn out. So what can we do in advance of that to reduce the risk of that happening? There are lots of myths about burnout, and I just want to touch on a few of them here briefly. One of them is that people feel like you must be weak or inadequate or a failure. And this is one of the reasons why people don't reach out, because they feel like that. They really feel like, everyone else around me is coping just fine and managing all these different things. And here I am with less seemingly even than these other people, and I'm struggling to get out of bed, and I don't know how to manage all of this, and I feel overwhelmed. And that's not the case. That usually what we're seeing is very capable, strong people. It's just that what's being asked of them is too much, and all those people around you who you think are doing just fine are not doing just fine. The problem is that these strong, resilient people are very good at keeping up that kind of facade that everything was okay. And so we continue on, and we look good. We show up to work dressed in our normal clothes, or maybe we're on Zoom dressed in our normal clothes, looking good, often functioning very well until late stages of burnout. So we can give off that image that everything's okay. And because we can all do that, it reinforces that feeling that, yeah, everyone else is fine and this is just me and there's something wrong with me. The second one is that the only solution is to quit. And certainly in some cases, then I would say that is the best option to in terms of how to respond to burnout, but most people don't need to. So it's always going to be a very individual decision and depends on those individual circumstances. But for most people, there are enough things that you can do and change that you can continue in that role if that's what you want to do, continue in that job and feel that it's sustainable and you can achieve things there and you're doing what you want to do there and survive. So there are lots of other options other than quitting your job. And I think that's really important to recognize, because otherwise people feel like, well, there's nothing anyone can do except for me quitting my job. So I don't need, there's no point in seeking any help because there's nothing anyone can do for me. The third one, it'll just get better if I push through it. I think this is a pretty common response, that people just think, chin up, carry on, grit your teeth and bear it, all those kinds of things that we say. And just hope that it will get better. And look, sometimes it does. There are some times where it's short-term circumstances and things change, and if you can push through that tough bit, then things get better. But unfortunately, in most cases, it doesn't. Things tend to get worse. Yes, that stress that was there at that time might have resolved, but you know what life's like. It just feels like it's one thing after another, after another, after another, and you're kind of always waiting for this time when you think things are going to be easier. And it just never quite gets there. So again, I just really encourage you, if you're struggling or if you know somebody else who's struggling, to take it seriously and do something about it and not just kind of cross your fingers and hope. The third one is burnout being a mild form of depression. This was actually believed sort of in the literature and some areas of the psychology circles early on. So it was around the 1970s that burnout was first described. And because there is quite a big overlap between the symptoms of burnout and depression, then it was thought that it was pretty similar and studied in that way. It's not, they're quite different things. The way they present do have differences. The way that we manage it can be different, but they coexist often. So anybody who thinks they've got burnout should also get reviewed to think about, is there something else going on as well? Do I also have depression or anxiety or some other form of mental illness? And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on as well. The fifth one is that you just need holidays, some annual leave. If I can just push through until my summer 4 weeks off or whatever it might be, and then it'll be okay. I can catch up on things and I can relax. And I'm sure most of you have probably experienced the kind of situation where you do that and then you come back and within 3 days you just feel as though you never went on your holidays. So yes, time off can be really helpful. It's often a part of burnout recovery, but it's not the whole story. And it's really important how we approach leave and what we do with that leave and what kind of expectations we have and what we do after and before. So it's a complicated thing, and just having that break won't necessarily solve anything. And then the last one there is resilience training is the solution. And I mentioned this one because resilience training's become a bit of a buzzword, a bit of a thing among organizations over recent years. And it's a difficult thing because often they've got some really great ideas and interventions in there and things that would be really, really helpful for people. But the problem is that often framing it that way and having it as resilience training puts that blame almost on those individuals that, yes, here we are, we've got these employees who are burnt out. You all need to go away and do your yoga or your whatever and get your resilience training, and then everything will be okay. And it kind of feels like it offloads that responsibility from the organization onto those individuals. And so it's resilience training can be part of it, but when it does, it needs to be alongside those interventions from a workplace point of view and an acknowledgement of what is happening from the workplace as well. And again, I'll touch on that a little bit later. We all respond to burnout differently. So I've talked about those initial 3 phases, but how that actually plays out in your life can be quite different. For some people, I've got somebody there owning a bottle of wine, because for some people that kind of response might be that they start having a glass of wine on a Friday night to try to switch off, and then it turns into every night, and then before you know it, it's a bottle of wine a night. And those kinds of things can creep up. It's for somebody else, it might be that they're binge watching TV, or they're eating in response to stress, or that they get physical symptoms. So maybe they're getting headaches or tummy aches, or high blood pressure, or they're feeling dizzy, or whatever it is. So looking for these individual responses is important in terms of figuring out what's going on, but also just in terms of getting to know yourself and what those signs of burnout are. Because when we talk about burnout recovery, it's not like we just go, right, well, we've fixed burnout now and I'll be fine forever. It's always this ongoing thing, because we're all humans facing these situations and challenges where we're pushed beyond what we can manage. And it depends on how long that goes on for and how many of those things are out at a time. So all those situations in life are going to continually arise. So it's more about going, okay, let's deal with this initial episode of burnout. But then what are we doing long term? How are we going to prevent further relapses? How are we going to detect those? So when you get to know, okay, for me, one of those first signs that I'm getting burnt out again is that I start snapping at everybody around me. I'm normally a pretty patient person, but I just feel really irritated by everybody. Then maybe for that person, that's kind of what they're looking out for. In terms of workplaces and why it's important, I think really important for workplaces to think about it, is not just because we want to go, well, isn't it nice to have happy employees? Yes, it is nice to have happy employees and healthy employees, but it's not just that. In terms of an investment from a workplace, we're also looking at what impact that has from a business point of view. And we know that if we can manage mental illness or burnout's not actually a mental illness, but it still has these same kinds of effects on workplaces. So we're looking at absenteeism, presenteeism. So this is where employees are turning up to work, but they're not as productive as they usually would be. We're going to reduce turnover, obviously. I mean, we see so many people who are burnt out who quit their jobs because it's not sustainable for them anymore. And that cost of training and recruiting to replace those people is a really significant thing to think about. And then at a more severe point of view, then we're often talking about workers' compensation claims, overall impact on profit of all of these things added together. And then that effect on reputation as well is really important, because it often comes out in the media and things too, doesn't it? When we look at how are people treated and how do people feel as part of that workplace. COVID has had obviously a massive impact on burnout. So we know that that's increased burnout rates, and it's made life a lot more unpredictable. We've often lost those social networks that we would often rely upon, or had to find ways to adapt to that. Financial stresses for a lot of people. So all sorts of things, fear about health. For some people, there have been some positive elements to it. So, there are some people who working from home, for example, and having that flexibility has actually been a really good thing. Maybe they now don't have to commute 2 hours to work each day, or it allows them to do some other things in life that are really important to them. Maybe they care for an elderly parent or something like that, and they can sort of do some of these other things as part of their work day. So there have been some positive things, communities coming together. This was from an Australian survey looking at rates of burnout amongst leaders since the onset of COVID. And so they found that 84% of leaders are at risk of burnout. And that's a really important thing to think about, because obviously from a leadership point of view, then if we've got burnt out leaders, then that flow-on effect to everybody else in the organisation is really big. So recognising that this affects everybody, and so when we're looking at solutions, it's not just about front-facing staff, but it's everybody at every level of leadership needing to think about these things and take action if they notice that burnout is coming on. Anybody's at risk anytime. Burnout is just very, very common, and it can be pretty unpredictable. Sometimes the people that you think that they just seem so on top of everything all the time, and you could never imagine them burning out, and they can. It's really just that thing that it just takes those right circumstances to arise. It's not about identifying these weak individuals or these individuals who are lacking in some way. It's just about, there's this person with those skills and resources and whatever they've got, and then there's these circumstances that we're putting them in, and how are they matching up to each other. And so it doesn't matter how strong and resilient somebody is, there will always be some kind of circumstances that you can put them in which will tip them over into burnout. So it can happen to anybody, but there are some individual and workplace factors that make that more likely to happen. So from an individual point of view, we can look at things like personality. So type A, kind of perfectionist personalities are more likely to burn out. If people have got a history of past burnout or mental illness, then they're more likely to burn out. There's those cumulative life stresses. So it's not just work, but what else is going on? Are there relationship issues? Are there sick family members? Are there financial stresses? Is there a pandemic? All those things add together. There's our cognitive processes and learn strategies. So this is looking at how do we internalize our experiences and the events that are going on around us, because we can have, 100 people who all experience the same workplace stress, for example, but the impact on each individual is going to be different. And it's the way that we internalize those experiences that can really shift that. And that develops over a long period of time. It's not kind of a choice. It's partly a genetic thing, but then it's also how were we treated, what was modeled to us, and what neural pathways have been strengthened, and how has that been shaped over time. And then there's our general health and well-being. So again, this is a bit like the cumulative life stresses. If we're managing other health problems, then that's a huge extra thing that adds on to that load. From a workplace point of view, there are 6 key areas that we look at in terms of increasing the risk of burnout. So one is workload. So looking at how many hours somebody's working, how much work is required of them. That if people are working really long hours, then it means that they don't get that chance to kind of rest and recover as much as they need in between times. So they get exhausted. If there are unreasonable deadlines and time pressures, especially if they're ongoing and uncertain. So sometimes if we've got a short-term deadline that we work really hard towards and we know there's a little bit of a break, then that's a bit different to if it keeps on getting postponed or we don't know where that endpoint is. The second one is our level of control. So how much autonomy do we have? How much control do we have over how we do our work or what we do at work? Are we micromanaged in the way that we do things? Are we able to do tasks in a way that suits our skill set and preferences and interests and values and all those other things? Another example of that would be, say, if you've got bosses who maybe don't communicate things particularly clearly, and so your level of control is not great. You can't control those expectations of you, but it's also different from different people, and so there's that conflict of nothing that I do can actually have a positive outcome overall. Anything that I do is going to upset somebody. The third one is the level of reward. So this is looking at not just our financial reward, which can have a big role in it, but it's also that recognition and our social standing and emotional reward, all those kinds of things that we get from our work. And are we actually getting that? What kind of reward do we get from going to work? And how is that distributed? Does it feel like people get recognized based on the amount of work they do? Or does it feel like there's this unfair distribution? And if it's unfair, then obviously that increases the risk of burnout. Then there's that level of community. So what kind of support do people have? What's that kind of culture there? When people make mistakes or don't perform so well, is there a culture of people being blamed for that? Or do people kind of share accountability or look for multiple sources of how that mistake or error was made? Is there trust between employees? How are they communicating? And then there's fairness, which we've touched on a little bit in terms of that distribution of reward. And so, yeah, reward opportunities, how they're distributed, how decision-making is communicated is really important there as well. So it's not necessarily about having people's preferences acted upon, but having people listened to in terms of their preferences can make a really big difference. So how are those decisions made, and does it feel fair in terms of how other people were taken into account, more so than what that actual outcome was? And then our values. So usually people are drawn to a workplace because of some kind of values match between what they want to do in that organization, but there can be a mismatch. So if somebody's working for an organization where it feels like they're going against one of their values, then that's this constant ongoing tension there. So there could be an actual mismatch there where they're really having to go against their values, or it might just be that there's not much of an opportunity there to align things with their values and actually feel like their work is meaningful and productive and contributing to society and all those sorts of things. So what I want you to do now is we've only got a little bit of time left, but I want to take 3 minutes maybe for everybody to have a look at this checklist. So there's a more complicated version of this on my website, which is a little bit more nuanced, because here it's just kind of like you tick or you cross, and everyone's got a different threshold for that. So I've got different options on the website, but this is a helpful starting point. This is not some kind of standardized burnout measure like we use in research. This is a list of common things that I've seen amongst my clients and the people that I've talked to over the last 6 or so years. And you can count up how many you've got, but more important than that exact number is just that you're spending a few minutes just reflecting on, are there multiple things here that are affecting you that you're struggling with? Are you just ticking like 2 or 3, or are you ticking 20? And just getting that feel for whether or not you think that burnout might be a problem for you. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to just read through and tally up with your fingers or something how many are affecting you, thinking back over the last 4 to 6 weeks kind of time frame. So I'm going to leave it there. If you didn't have time to get through it all, then you can go onto my website and do that version later on if you want to. To give you an example, I ticked 5 of those boxes just now because things are going pretty well, and this is my job. Like I'm sort of always thinking about these things and trying to do this as much as I can, but I'm the same as everybody else. I mean, I've got all these sort of stresses that come up, and homeschooling the kids, and I've got 5 kids, and then I'm running a business and all those other things that happen. So you know, everyone's got to tick some boxes, but I would have had times in my life, so especially sort of 5 or 6 years ago, where I would have easily been ticking 20 or so of those. So often this kind of measure, everyone interprets these questions differently. It's not a set score. So the most important thing about it is that kind of change over time. So for me, I can look at, well, I've got 5 now, but what does that mean? Well, before I was ticking 25. So thinking about that over time, repeating it at different times can be a helpful way of just seeing, because these kinds of changes can come up really slowly and we don't necessarily notice them because it's been this gradual onset over sort of 5 or 6 months of several different things. And sometimes sitting down and doing that little bit more of a objective kind of self-assessment can be a helpful thing to monitor things over time. So we've got 4 minutes left, and I'm going to race through some things about prevention and management, but it's going to be pretty brief. So when I talk to people about preventing burnout, a lot of these same things are part of management processes as well, but they're really good for prevention because management gets a little bit more individual. For prevention, you Google how to manage burnout or prevent burnout and you get thousands of different things, and sometimes people start doing too many things at once and it becomes really overwhelming. So I break it down into 3 areas and then I stick values underneath it. And I say, if you can do one thing that works well for you and it's manageable and achievable in each of those areas, then you're off to a really good start and doing a lot better than most people. So that first one is the way that we interact with the world around us, our social networks, the way that we set boundaries, the way that we separate work from home, things like that. So if you can identify one thing that relates to any of those things and figure out what can I do about that, what's one thing I can do about that that's really achievable that I can do consistently. Then the second one is our cognitive processes. So how do we manage negative emotions? How do we manage stress? What's going on in our brain? So that's the negative emotions. How do we create positive emotions? Because our brain doesn't really like to notice positive things anywhere near as much as negative things, because evolutionarily, in terms of safety and things, the bad things and the stresses are much more important to focus on. So how do we create those positive things in our life? How do we show ourselves compassion? How are we kind to ourselves and not just to the people around us? And also in there, if people struggle with things like perfectionism or imposter syndrome, then they would go in there as well. So what out of all of that do you feel like would be just one thing you could work on? And then the third one is that mind-body connection. So we know there's this really strong link between our physical health and our mental health. So when we think about things like our nutrition, our level of physical activity, our sleep, things like, are we drinking or smoking or anything else health related? Maybe it's that you've got a chronic illness and there's something in relation to managing that could be improved. I spend an hour and a half in workshops running through just what's on this slide to get people to come up with a plan. So I'm just really rushing through that now. And then really being clear on what your personal values are, because that then underpins all those other things and the way that we think about all those other things. So that's the prevention side of things. When somebody's experiencing burnout, then as I mentioned before, the first thing you need to do is to see your GP or some kind of practitioner and get an objective assessment, because we're really not very good at assessing ourselves. So even I see a lot of doctors and people as clients, they tell other people how to do this kind of stuff every day, and it's very different to doing it for yourself. So it's always, doesn't matter what your job is, how much you know about this kind of stuff, you need someone else to actually decide for you, how bad is this? What do we need to do immediately? So there's that initial management that then comes next. So for some people, that might mean that they take time off work. It's just going to vary very individually depending on the situation. And then there's that ongoing support and maintenance, which I mentioned as being really important, because recovery takes a while, and then it's that ongoing input to make sure that it either doesn't happen again or that you pick it up early when it happens again so you can manage it well. When we look at how people recover from burnout, it's not like the blue line. We like to think it's going to be like that. It's more like the orange line. So we get those ups and downs, and that can be really disheartening when you get those downs. And often what we see is at that first dip that I've got circled here, then people think, oh, all those things that I was doing, I finally reached out and got some help, and that orange line went up and I was feeling really positive about things, and then it dips back down and people go, oh, that wasn't working, nothing's going to work, and ditch it all. And totally understandable. But the problem is if you persist, then it will keep on trending up even with those ups and downs. So I just really encourage anybody, if they've reached out for help, when they hit that first slump, that's the time to double down and somehow keep going, getting that support so you can get through that. And then the other thing is that people stop too early. So they go, right, okay, I've just got to the point that things feel manageable. Great. Okay, I'll stop doing all these things that I was doing to get there. And then they dive back down again, or they're not prepared for it when it recurs. Sometimes people feel like the solutions are really big. So, you know, there's that resignation one there. We talked about that it doesn't have to be actually leaving your job or doing some great big change. Sometimes it feels as though, well, all the problems and all the things that led to this were really big, so the solution must be really big, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes they're really little things. And then the other thing is sometimes people try to do everything. So, you know, they're changing the way they're eating and they're running and they're journaling and they're meditating and everything all at once, and it's too much. And I've got to time, so I'm going to do this really fast. Okay, so when we're looking at from a workplace point of view, so what I was just talking about is how we manage it from an individual point of view. From a workplace point of view, then the first thing is we need to address it at all levels, not just at one particular level. We need to start at the top. If there's not that genuine caring about it from the top, then people know, and it affects the whole culture and well-being and uptake of any kind of responses and strategies and things that you try to do. And leading by example is really important. Identifying at-risk people is a really important thing in workplaces. So as I said before, that might be that you're looking at individuals who are at risk because of their own personal life and risk factors, or it could be teams. So you might know, okay, in this organization, this team is really stressful and they're the ones who get these really big deadlines and stuff like that. So we know we need to put extra input and care and monitoring into them. Having really clear policies that explain it all, so that you don't get to the situation where somebody's really burnt out and struggling and defeated, and then they've got to somehow figure out how to navigate it and who do I even go to, and what is there some kind of leave policy for this? Have it really communicated so that everybody knows all the time before they get to that kind of situation. Making sure that people, if they are burnt out, can actually access things. You know, can they actually get time off work to get to their appointments? Can they actually, can we reduce their workload at all? Or, you know, what can we actually do so that we're facilitating that support that they need? What's this one? So then if you've got the situation where you've identified somebody who's burnt out, just making sure there's really good communication there and regularly reviewing that situation. When people get that wrong, when workplaces get that wrong, it feels a bit like this. So this was about a hospital, obviously with junior doctor there and hospital executives, but really it applies to any kind of business, that there's often this perception that the workplaces don't really take that accountability for their sort of role in burnout, and they just think, just do some mindfulness and have this yoga workshop and we've solved the problem and ticked the box. There's some other things that came up, that what have I told you, workplace wellness activities are part of the problem. Every company says we'd like to promote mental health in the workplace, and the employees say, how about hiring more people so we feel less pressured and increase our pay so we can keep up with the spiraling cost of living so we're not so stressed out. And every company says, no, not like that, try yoga. So, I mean, obviously this kind of thing happens a lot because it's everywhere. You get all these memes and things popping up. So it's really important that that there's this match there between the organization caring and actually living that out. Otherwise, we get these organizations where they're sort of saying all the right things and they look really good and the policies look all nice, but we know that behind the scenes things are really toxic and not managed well and people are really struggling there. So I've had to rush through that last little bit quite fast, but I hope that that's given you a little bit of an overview, a little bit of insight into yourself and how you're sitting in terms of burnout at the moment. And for other people around you, that if you've got people around you who you think are struggling and burnt out, that you might be able to reach out. Just look after yourself as well as you do that, though, that you don't have to take on all their problems or solve all their problems, but often just having somebody to talk to and take them seriously and just listen and just gently guide them towards seeking their own help from somebody else can really make a huge amount of difference. So if I can help at all, we're going to do some questions now, but also there's my email address there, that if people have questions afterwards that I can't get to today or anything else, then please get in touch. And I will stop sharing my screen so Rob can take over.
Amy, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. There was lots of things that resonated with me there. Let's jump into the questions, because there's some really, people are really engaging with this topic. An interesting one that I saw, actually, how did you manage burnout during your PhD? Now, I don't know if you did a PhD, Amy, but let us know.
For me, during my PhD,
yeah,
I have not done a PhD. I have supported several people through PhDs, and I can't say it's made me want to do a PhD myself.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. It's a huge amount of work.
I mean, the problem is in my work that I see everyone who's struggling, right? So I probably have a slightly skewed perception of the realities of these. Look, I would say that PhDs are incredibly stressful and difficult for so many reasons, and I don't have any personal tips to share with that. and I think it's really hard because also people are often not earning a lot during their PhD. They've just sort of got that a little bit of financial support. So it's also really difficult sometimes to access some of those services that might be more costly. But I would just say, please don't just think it's just me, it's everyone else is doing just fine. All the other PhD candidates seem like they're on top of things. They're not. And please reach out to somebody, you know, go and see your GP is probably a really good point to start off with, and just see what they've got to suggest to begin with. I would love to give a whole lot more advice, but I feel like I could get into a really big, long, involved discussion. And yeah, whoever asked that question, if you want to email me afterwards, then please do.
Yes, great. Thank you. Okay, now we've got a good question here from Peter Ship. Peter says, hi, how as a partner are you best able to support your partner who may be going through burnout?
I get asked this question all the time. It's really hard, isn't it, to see somebody else struggling and not to know what to do about it. This was actually the whole way the Burnout Project started originally, was that what I was seeing amongst my patients when I was working as a GP is that often the individuals recognized it and acknowledged it really late. It was all the people around them who were going, this person's struggling, like, what can we do to help? But often that individual isn't even acknowledging it, let alone at the point of being ready to do something about it. And it does take time. It's kind of like any kind of problem. And especially because people feel that weakness and failure and all that sort of emotional side caught up with it, that they don't want to acknowledge that there's that problem there. And so that's why I created burnout packages. So that's got like a book and some other resources and stuff in there. Because I thought, well, if we can get these people who know that somebody else is burned out to send this package, so that's what people often do, is they'll buy it and send it to somebody else anonymously, and then they've got this little prompt that, hey, somebody else is really worried about me, and it's got some resources that get started and things. So often just that showing that you care and you're there for them is a really important part of it. Sometimes we just want them to get help, we just want them to do something, right? And we kind of wish that we could just force that to happen, and unfortunately we can't. And it's really hard to stay patient and just trying to continue to keep those conversations open to make it so that when they're ready to talk about it, then they can, encouraging them to see their GP. You know, often if you're their partner, then you know them best, and you might know there are certain things that are good for their well-being, and sort of encouraging them to make that time, or even when they're tired, to engage in some of those things that you think might be beneficial for them. But really it's trying to get them to that point of getting some sort of external support, which is usually the biggest step forward, because you can't as a partner take on both the partner role and the treating somebody for burnout role very well. It just sort of doesn't. Yeah. So you kind of need to recognize that limitation to what you can do, and just trust that is the best thing that you can do, is to be there listening and keeping that conversation open for them. Yeah.
So we've got a good question here from an anonymous guest today. What would you suggest as an approach in the workplace where you have repeatedly voiced issues with workload and the managers articulate support and understanding of the issues, but nothing seems to change?
Yeah, that's a really hard one, and unfortunately pretty common. It's really hard because, you know, you're clearly expressing the issue that you've identified and requesting support with that, and then not getting that support. So I suppose one side of it is thinking, is there another way I can go about this, in terms of, is there a different way I can communicate this issue? Are they not really understanding what I'm saying? Am I not really quite conveying how or why this is difficult, or why I feel maybe it's inequitably distributed amongst the team or something like that? So is there a communication issue that I could somehow do differently, or go to somebody else, or approach it in a different way? If not, then these would be the kinds of cases where I end up seeing people leave their jobs, because in the end there's only so much you can do. So when you're looking at burnout from an individual point of view, from a workplace point of view, there's all these things that we want to look at that we can do if they're into it. But from an individual point of view, you can't control the workplace. You've got a certain level of influence. And so it's looking at, what are those changes that I can make? And once you've made those changes that you can make, then it's that question of, well, is that enough? If I've done everything I can and I cannot modify this workload, and if I can't modify this workload, this is not sustainable for me, then that's where you look at going elsewhere and doing something different. Or you might go, I've repeatedly tried to change this workload. I cannot change the workload. However, for XYZ reason, I still find this job really fulfilling, and I can make these changes here and here and here. And given that, it's hard, but I can manage this. And for now, that's what I'm going to do is keep going, even though I can't change that. So it's a tricky situation.
Yeah. We've got an interesting question from Kirsten. She said, how do you know when you've recovered from burnout?
Yeah, good question. Because the problem is all those things just change and fluctuate over life anyway, don't they? I mean, as a very general rule of thumb, I talk about it sort of returning to normal, whatever kind of normal is for you, because that's how we detect burnout, is what's a change from normal for you. So when we're looking at that checklist that I had up there earlier, that's the problem, is that we're looking at, is this different? Because some people would normally tick those boxes because that's just the way they are. So when you feel like you're back to how you would think that you are normally, but also we're looking for a feeling that you're not necessarily happy, in that we're not looking for this kind of unrealistic joy all the time, but is life feeling like it's manageable, that we have a normal kind of level of energy, that we're able to do the things that we need to do and the things that we want to do, that we feel some sort of sense of motivation in our work or in our life, that there are things that we're working towards, sort of goals, that we're feeling some sort of sense of meaning through what we're doing. Those kinds of things, as opposed to that dread and fatigue and things like that. And that's also where this kind of repeated use of a burnout checklist or something can be really helpful, because the recovery is just as slow as the onset. So, you know how I was saying that at the onset it sort of creeps up and so you don't notice it. Well, the same thing with the recovery. Sometimes it's small changes over time, and over 6 months or a year you sort of jump up here, but it's happened so slowly that you haven't really noticed. And so sometimes doing that checklist, then you might sort of look at that and compare it to the previous one and go, oh yeah, it didn't really feel like any different, but actually now I remember that back then I was doing this and this and this, and I'm not noticing that anymore. And you sort of see that.
I've just seen a question. This is anonymous again. A lot of the checklist that you put up also overlaps with menopause and perimenopause symptoms. So how can an individual tease those two apart?
Yeah, see your GP. Yeah, it overlaps with so many different things. Like I see so many people who they think they're burnt out and they've got iron deficiency or they've got a thyroid disorder. I've seen somebody who actually had an early cancer and it presented as like an anxiety kind of condition. Like there's so many different things that can be going on, both in terms of mental health and physical health. And often when people think they're burnt out, they are, because the reason why they've thought they're burnt out is because there's work-related stresses. But it can be compounded by these other things going on as well. So it's usually that, yeah, you're burnt out and you're going through menopause, or you're burnt out and you're iron deficient. And so you still need to diagnose that correctly, because obviously if you're not treating those other things going on, then there's only so much difference you're going to make by looking at the burnout side of things.
Yeah, sure. Emily has asked an interesting question. I think this is very hard to answer, I think, but she's asked if you have advice that one could use to approach an employer who is not upholding their responsibility to staff welfare, that is resulting in mass staff burnout. Should an individual take that on? Can they take that on?
Yeah, that's such a hard question. I mean, as an example, I work with doctors, and as a healthcare system, there are so many issues with it and so much burnout there. So I see sort of these kinds of issues happening just all the time. Do you take it on is a really good question. And it's, again, a very individual thing, in that sometimes when we see advocacy for this kind of thing, then we see change. But it depends on what you're wanting as a result and what you're willing to risk for that result. So unfortunately, although there are often systems there, so I'll use the example of workplace bullying, which can often be one of the things that's contributing to burnout. There are systems there for complaints for bullying and the way that organizations deal with that. But the problem is that often by going through that process makes it far worse for the individual, and the risk of negative repercussions for that individual career-wise, at least in that organization, potentially further than that from going through that process, can be significant. So it's really important from an individual perspective to talk to somebody else about it and get somebody else's opinion before you take action, just to make sure that you've really thought through, what am I doing? What am I hoping to achieve from that? What are the potential positive and negative outcomes? And am I willing to risk that? Usually the biggest changes I see are when people band together sort of with some sort of legal approach as a group sort of action. I suppose I'm thinking of sort of big organizations as opposed to smaller businesses.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways to go about it, but as much as I would love to say, yes, everybody just stand up for yourselves and, make sure that people are being treated right, because we should be, and there's legal protections there, and we should be able to do that. It's not as simple as that, and we need to be really careful with how we navigate it.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll do an interesting question here around the concept of disconnecting from friends. So Eva says, how to reconnect people when you find yourself withdrawing from socializing in the climate of COVID?
Yeah, COVID just made it so much more difficult, hasn't it? I'm not sure exactly which element she's talking about. It's really hard trying to manage distant friendships, where you can't see people in person, or you're in lockdown or something. And so using those other formats, I suppose I just encourage sort of trying to engage with some of those other formats and find something that works well for you, accepting that it won't be as good. Instead of, I see some people who think, well, I just don't really like using Zoom, and so they just don't get in touch with their friends, but sometimes sort of accepting that there's that imperfect format there. For other people who've just sort of been isolating and feeling burnt out and not having that energy to do it, that's a bit of a different situation. And I would often say that it's worth socializing even when you don't feel like it, when you sort of feel worn out, you're like, oh, I just can't face people. It depends, sometimes that's what you need, is to just have some quiet time, but it's very easy for that to just become then the normal state for you, and for it to get harder and harder and harder over time to re-engage with those friendships that you've not done. And so in that case, if you feel like it's sort of going on and you could actually sort of force yourself to do it, then sometimes that's really worth it, is just doing it and getting back into those habits and making sure that there's some little level of that connection continuing, so that then as you start to recover, or as life becomes a little bit easier, it's much easier to pick up those friendships than if you've had no contact at all for a period of time. I don't know if that's kind of what she's mentioning, or whether you think she might have been getting at something different there.
No, that seems to hit the mark for me. Interesting point here. Someone has said, my GP was dismissive of my burnout. She said, everyone is like that. What do you recommend?
I would say that, GPs are like anybody, that they've all got their own strengths and interests, and you're going to get a far better response going there with burnout from somebody who's got an interest in mental health, probably. So sometimes when you look up on the practice, they list their kind of interest areas. So it might be worth, hopefully this wasn't somebody who was had a special interest in mental health who they saw, but looking for somebody who's got that interest. And this is also a reason why I say that everybody should already have a GP. So if you already know somebody when you're well and you've got that connection going, often with sort of part-time GPs and group practices, then it's about slowly over time getting to know a few of the different GPs, so that then when you've got a problem, you've got somebody who you kind of know what they're like to a certain degree, and you've got a feeling for, I feel like I could go and open up to them. Whereas when you're feeling really burnt out, if you don't even have a GP who you've even met before, or you have one but you kind of feel like you don't really click with them, then you're not going to be as likely to go and find a new GP or to go and see somebody who you don't trust. So it can be a little bit tricky trying to find them. And I would say if you go to a GP and you feel dismissed, then go somewhere else, whether that's to another GP or seeing somebody like me. I mean, there are other professions that deal with burnout. You can go directly to a psychologist, for example, and get support that way. But yeah, it's really discouraging, isn't it, when you're feeling burnt out, and it takes so much to actually go and disclose that and discuss that with somebody else to then feel like it's dismissed. Yeah, it's really hard.
Yeah. Okay, well, Amy, thank you so much. That was a really fabulous session. Lots for us all to think about. So,
Thank you.
yeah, to the people who asked questions that we weren't able to get to, apologies. We would have loved to have got to all of them, but Amy has kindly shared her email address and her website. So it's, let me get this right. So it's theburnouproject.com.au.
Yeah, that's right.
Is your website?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and your email is info@theburnouproject.com.au.
Very original.
Yeah, it works, right? So we'll also, with Amy's permission, share those details in the follow-up email that we'll send after this event. So Amy, sincere thanks. And I'm sure all of our listeners today would like to join me, albeit silently, in thanking you as well. We've seen this afternoon in Amy a great example of the prime expertise that we have within our alumni community. The recording of this afternoon's presentation will be available on our YouTube channel, which you can access through the Explore website. So the link should now be on your screens, and there it is. We will be continuing the Explore online series throughout the year with more opportunities for self-progression and creativity. So please keep a lookout for further invitations. We would love to know if there are any topics that you would like to hear in our Explore series, or perhaps if you're a member of the alumni community who would like to offer your expertise. If so, please reach out to our team via the contact details on your screens. There is also an upcoming opportunity for you to join another online public lecture as part of the university's Island of Ideas series tomorrow at 5 p.m. That lecture tomorrow is called The Climate Emergency: Can Your Choices Change Our Future? You can hear from a panel of experts as to how you can make a difference in your daily life. The link to register is at the bottom of your screen if you are interested in attending. That now brings us to the conclusion of today's presentation. Thank you once again for taking the time to join us. Thank you once again to our wonderful presenter, Dr. Amy Imms. It was a real pleasure to hear from you today. And we will see you at the next Explore. Thank you very much. My name is Rob Blanford.